How's it going, NPC Nation? Welcome back to a brand new video. This video has been called What If Thomas Dewey Won the 1948 Election? So let's look at the current timeline. The current timeline is everyone thought Dewey was going to beat Truman. He was very unpopular. But the thing is, he wasn't that much unpopular to lose to Dewey. But it was still a close race. Thomas Dewey, who is, if you don't know who he is the governor. He was one of the governors of New York. But let's say Thomas Dewey. Let's look at our current scenario. Our timeline is Truman beats Dewey. Everyone thought, even the newspaper companies thought Dewey was going to beat Truman. That's why they printed it, Dewey beats Truman. That's why we got that famous picture of Truman holding up the newspaper that says Dewey beats Truman. And he didn't. It was not a walloping in the 48 election like it was for FDR in his 4 terms, because the only reason Truman became president, FDR, dies in 1945 after he wins his 4th term. They make an amendment except for Truman because he's grandfathered into it before the amendment is made in the Constitution that no person can run for more than 2 terms for president. Well, 1948 comes. Let's say Dewey wins. Let's look at the alternative timeline. Dewey wins. What happens then? This affects future presidential elections, by the way. Because if Dewey wins, Dwight D. Eisenhower does not become president. Dwight D. Eisenhower, I don't think, would run in 60. He's getting old. He's, getting up there in age. And there's no point for him to run in 60. He's done a lot in his career. He's a general, one of the best generals. And let's say this, doesn't affect a lot. This is going to affect probably the 1960 election because Dewey's going to win a 2nd term. He's going to win the 52, just like Dwight D. Eisenhower did. He's going to win the 52. Okay, he goes on, wins. And I think with Dewey in charge, we don't go into Vietnam because he'll keep us out of Vietnam. I think Dewey would keep us out of Vietnam, so that make him and the Republicans more popular. Who does he select as his vice president? Well, there's a lot of nominees he could select. Eisenhower. I don't think he would because Eisenhower's getting older, and Eisenhower, there's no one convinces him to run because there's no reason for him to run in 52 or 48 as his vice president. So Dewey selects someone else. Nixon, he doesn't want Nixon. We don't know who he would select. But 52, he selects Nixon as his vice president. He switches it up. He drops his current vice president because I don't know who he would select in 48 to be his vice president. But now we have Thomas Dewey, and Richard Nixon. This is going to affect a lot. I think Thomas Dewey would keep us out of Vietnam. I don't think he would put us in Vietnam like Eisenhower did. I think he would keep us out of Vietnam. So that makes him very popular, and it makes the Republicans very popular because we're not in Vietnam. We're not going back into war. It's a couple years after the World War II just ended, so I don't think we're going into World War II, Vietnam. Thomas Dewey wins re-election in 52. So 1960, JFK still runs in this timeline, and after Thomas Dewey does his 2 terms, JFK still runs, and Richard Nixon still runs, but Richard Nixon wins. Richard Nixon becomes the 35th president of the United States, and there's no assassination of JFK in this timeline. Because JFK didn't win. We do get civil rights. March is pushed back a little bit, but JFK doesn't run. He runs in 60, and then runs and loses in 60. Richard Nixon wins re-election in 64, becomes president earlier because Thomas Dewey kept us out of Vietnam. Vietnam's still going to happen, but Thomas Dewey keeps us out. So popular, president. Richard Nixon is just going to ride Thomas Dewey's popularity because Thomas Dewey selected him in 52, dropped his current vice president, selected Nixon in 52. I think Nixon wins in 60, becomes president in 64. No Watergate because he wins it by a landslide in 64. So there's no Watergate. Nixon doesn't resign. And he does select Spiro Agnew still. Nixon still selects Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew still doesn't resign at all, just like Nixon. Spiro Agnew goes on to run in 70. In 68. He goes on to run in 68. And JFK goes on to run in 68. This time JFK does win because Robert Kennedy goes on to become his vice president instead of Lyndon B. Johnson. It just pushes back JFK's presidency. I think JFK will still become president, but it would just take it would take 8 years after 1960 because Thomas Dewey becomes president in 48, wins in 52, and Richard Nixon takes that success of Thomas Dewey's presidency, keeps it out of Vietnam. Civil rights is pushed back into 60. Richard Nixon becomes the president of civil rights instead of JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson. There's no President Johnson at all. Johnson is not on the vice president ticket. JFK selects his brother. JFK wins in 68 after the 2 terms of Richard Nixon, who instead of becoming the 37th president, will become the 35th president. Becomes president basically years before he wins in 70, and before he wins in 72. Before he wins in 68, sorry, because he won in 68 and then won re-election in 72. Spiro Agnew takes that, runs in the 70s and wins in 72 because of the success of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon becomes the president of civil rights. We get the Civil Rights Act. There's no assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. He lives a full life. JFK lives a full life. He wins. I think JFK would win in 68 and win re-election in 72. And then Spiro Agnew would take over in 76 and become president in 76. And then we have President Spiro Agnew because of Thomas Dewey's win in 1948 and re-election in 52. Because Thomas Dewey, I think, would keep us out of Vietnam. Vietnam still happens. I don't think we would get involved, though, under Thomas Dewey. I think Thomas Dewey would be against war. I think he's a peace Republican. I think he was a peace candidate. I don't think he liked war at all. That's why I think he was against if I was correct, I think he was against atomic bomb use in 47. I'm not for sure. Not a lot of people know a lot about Thomas Dewey, but I think Thomas Dewey would beat, Thomas Dewey beats Truman in 48. I think that would push Nixon up instead of waiting into the 68 election. I think Nixon would win the presidency in 60, become president from 60 to 64, and then win from 60 and win re-election in 64. Beats JFK a second time because JFK doesn't run, but Johnson actually runs in 64 and loses. And then, like he did in 64 before, but he loses. And then JFK does run in 68, wins with Robert Kennedy, and then Spiro Agnew will take that vice presidency that he won in 1960 and run in 72 because JFK, wins in 76 because JFK will win 2 terms from 70. Instead of becoming president in 1960, I think JFK would become president in 1972 to 76, and then in 76, he would win. Instead of having Jimmy Carter there, JFK would become the 39th president of the United States, in my opinion, because of the Thomas Dewey It's just a whole timeline, because I think Thomas Dewey would keep us out of Vietnam. I think Thomas Dewey would be a great president. He would win 2 terms. He'd push Nixon to run in 60 versus JFK. Nixon wins because of the popularity of the previous guy, because no Vietnam. So Richard Nixon would run in 60, win, run again in 64, beat Lyndon Johnson, and then JFK would run in 68, win, and then run in 72, and then Spiro Agnew would run in 76, because JFK won in 68, ran in 72, so 76, Spiro Agnew would win because his popularity and because his there's no Vietnam, so America doesn't get involved. No Vietnam Memorial. We don't have to worry about it. We stay out of Vietnam. Spiro Agnew takes us in the 70s, and we would still get Ronald Reagan in the 80s. Would we get Jimmy Carter? Probably not. We would probably get Spiro Agnew's vice president. Spiro Agnew wins the presidency in 72. 76, he runs. And there would not be Jimmy Carter, because 72, Jimmy Carter ran in 72, and then he didn't run in 72. Nixon ran in 72 and won. Jimmy Carter, I don't think, would be president, because in 76 we would have someone else, and we would not have Gerald Ford and at all. In 76 election, we would not have Jimmy Carter. We would have Richard Nixon in the 1960s instead of 1970s, and instead of him in 68, we would have someone else. But that is what if Thomas Dewey became president of the United States. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like I said, I think it just pushed Nixon up farther in the presidential line. I think JFK will eventually become president. We would probably get Ronald Reagan, but I don't think we would get Jimmy Carter as our 39th president, because if you look at it, our 34th president would be Thomas Dewey. 35th would be Richard Nixon, because he takes that initiative, wins in 60, and then our 36th president, instead of being Lyndon Johnson, it would be JFK, and no assassination. And then the 37th president, I don't think Jimmy Carter would be the 39th president of the United States, because we would have the Spiro Agnew as 37th president. 38th president would probably be Ronald Reagan. It would probably push him farther up to the line, or it would be someone different, and then Jimmy Carter wouldn't win. Gerald Ford would probably win the 38th presidency, and then Jimmy Carter wouldn't be 39th president, I don't think. I think it would be someone different. I think in this alternate timeline, Ronald Reagan would probably be the 39th president, and then George H.W. Bush would be the 40th, and then George W. Bush would probably not be the 42nd president of the United States. 43rd president of the United States. I think Bill Clinton would not be the 42nd president. Sorry, I'm getting the numbers confused. And I don't think I think Thomas Dewey winning would probably not. It would probably push back Obama, or John McCain would probably be the 44th president of the United States. He would win his 2 terms, and then we would probably get Romney in 2016, or Trump still. But Thomas Dewey winning the presidency would push back so many things, and I think he would keep us out of Vietnam. Vietnam would still go on, but it would just be between North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese, and I think the North would still probably win, but the United States wouldn't get involved at all. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, press the share button, press the like button, press the red shiny subscribe button, press the bell so you're notified every time I upload a video, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.